The morning at Denver International Airport was like any other. Calm, routine, predictable. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the terminal as passengers dragged their luggage, eyes glued to their phones, barely acknowledging the world around them. Captain Mike Sanders walked through the employee-only corridor with his usual sharp, methodical pace. He had been a pilot for nearly 2 decades, known for his impeccable record and strict adherence to regulations. But he was also known for something else, his lack of patience. As he approached the gate for Flight 2743 to Dallas, a frown settled on his face. His first officer, Karen Lewis, a competent yet soft-spoken woman in her mid-30s, stood near the counter, scanning the passenger manifest with a furrowed brow. "Problem?" Mike asked, adjusting his neatly pressed uniform. Karen hesitated before replying, her voice careful. "We have a passenger in a wheelchair." Mike's jaw tightened. "And he's a former Marine. Daniel Carter. He lost his ability to walk in combat." Mike exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "And the airline approved this?" Karen gave him a disbelieving look. "Of course, Mike. It's 2025, not the 1950s. He ignored the sarcasm. "I don't like it. What if there's an emergency? How the hell is he going to evacuate?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have standard procedures for passengers with disabilities. Besides, he's a Marine. He's probably more capable than half the people on this flight." Mike wasn't convinced. "I want to see him." Without waiting for an answer, he strode toward the boarding area. The gate agent, a young woman named Rachel, looked up in surprise as he approached. "Captain Sanders? Where is he?" Rachel blinked, momentarily thrown off. Who?" "The passenger in the wheelchair." Rachel hesitated, then motioned toward the waiting area. Mike followed her gaze and spotted Daniel Carter. He was seated near the window, his wheelchair positioned neatly beside him. He wasn't frail or weak. If anything, he had the hardened build of a man who had once commanded power over his body. His broad shoulders stretched against the fabric of his jacket, and his hands rested calmly on his lap. A duffel bag sat at his feet. Mike's first thought, "He looks too comfortable." He approached, his shadow falling over Daniel. "Mr. Carter." Daniel looked up, meeting Mike's gaze with sharp blue eyes. He nodded. "Captain." Mike crossed his arms. "You're traveling alone?" Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "That's right. You understand the safety procedures?" "I do." Mike studied him for a moment before leaning in slightly. His voice was low but firm. "Look, I'm responsible for everyone on that plane. If there's an emergency, I need to know that every passenger can get out without delay. You might be a liability." Karen, who had followed closely behind, inhaled sharply. "Mike." Daniel held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes didn't waver. "I've dragged injured men out of burning wreckage under enemy fire. I think I can handle a damn seatbelt." A few passengers nearby overheard the exchange and began whispering. Rachel shifted uncomfortably at the gate. Mike exhaled through his nose. "This isn't about pride. It's about protocol." Daniel let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Right. Protocol." He shook his head. "Tell me, Captain, if I were walking on 2 legs, would we be having this conversation?" Silence. Mike's lips pressed together. He glanced at Karen, then at Rachel. Both women were watching him, waiting. He turned back to Daniel, his voice cold. "I'm not comfortable with you on this flight." A ripple of disbelief passed through the passengers nearby. Karen stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Mike, you can't." "I can," he interrupted. "And I am." Daniel sat there, unmoving. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw was visible. "So that's it. I'm being kicked off." Mike straightened his shoulders. "For safety reasons, yes." Daniel didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, he exhaled and reached for his duffel bag. Karen looked like she wanted to protest, but Daniel shook his head, silencing her. "I don't need to fight this," he muttered, mostly to himself. Passengers began whispering louder. A man in his 40s, sitting a few seats away, called out, "This is bullshit." An older woman added, "He's a damn veteran, For God's sake. Rachel looked like she wanted to shrink into the floor. Captain, we're going to have complaints. Let them complain, Mike snapped. Daniel hoisted his bag onto his lap and adjusted his wheelchair, rolling himself toward the gate exit. The crowd watched, some in anger, others in stunned silence. As he passed Mike, he stopped just for a second. You know, he said, his voice quiet but steady, one day, you're going to realize how wrong you were. I just hope it's not too late. Then, without another word, he rolled away. Mike watched him go, jaw clenched. Karen shook her head, her expression one of pure disappointment. You just made a huge mistake. Mike ignored her and turned back toward the jet bridge. Let's get this flight in the air. 7 minutes later, he would regret those words more than anything in his life. Mike Sanders settled into the left seat of the cockpit, fastening his harness with a sharp click. The hum of the engines vibrated through the fuselage as the pre-flight checks continued. Denver Tower, this is Flight 2743, requesting clearance for takeoff. Karen's voice was steady as she handled communications. Cleared for takeoff, 2743. Have a safe flight. Mike adjusted his headset and glanced at Karen. Let's get this in the air. She hesitated for a second, her fingers hovering over the controls. You sure you don't want to talk about what just happened? Mike's jaw tightened. Not now. Karen exhaled through her nose but said nothing. She eased the throttle forward, and the plane roared down the runway. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted gracefully into the crisp blue sky. Tension at 30,000 feet. The cabin lights flickered as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, some stretching, others murmuring about the incident at the gate. Word spread quickly. The pilot had removed a disabled veteran from the flight. A middle-aged businessman in seat 14A, who had witnessed the confrontation, leaned toward his roommate. Can you believe that? Kicking a Marine off the flight? What kind of captain does that? A woman across the aisle shook her head. I tried to say something, but they just let it happen. He didn't even argue. Just left. A few rows back, an older man muttered, That pilot's an arrogant bastard. That vet deserved better. The murmurs rippled through the cabin. Even the flight attendants noticed the tension, exchanging nervous glances as they moved down the aisle with beverage carts. In the cockpit, Mike was aware of the passengers' resentment but dismissed it. They don't understand. I made the right call. Karen, however, kept stealing glances at him. Do you even care that people are pissed? Mike adjusted the altitude controls, ignoring her. She scoffed. Of course you don't. Before Mike could respond, a sharp alarm pierced the air. The first sign of trouble. Red warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. The aircraft trembled slightly. Mike straightened. What the hell? Karen's hands flew over the controls. We're getting a fault on engine 2. Mike's heart pounded. That can't be right. We just did the checks. A flight attendant's voice crackled through the intercom. Captain, some passengers are reporting strange vibrations. Mike barely heard her. His mind was calculating. The right engine, if it was failing, they needed to act fast. Karen's fingers danced over the switches. I'm running diagnostics. It could be a sensor issue. But it wasn't. The aircraft lurched violently. A few passengers screamed as overhead bins rattled. Mike grabbed the controls. Flight attendants, take your seats. The engine failure warning blared. Mike's breath turned shallow. No. Not now. Not after all these years. Karen's voice cut through his thoughts. We're losing altitude. Outside, the blue sky remained deceptively calm, but inside, chaos brewed. In the cabin, oxygen masks dropped. A child started crying. A woman in first class clutched her husband's arm. What's happening? He didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the right engine, which now trailed black smoke. Karen's voice was tight. We need to prepare for an emergency landing. Mike's fingers clenched around the yoke. His stomach twisted as realization set in. Daniel Carter should have been here. The man he'd humiliated could have helped. But he wasn't. Because Mike had sent him away. The cockpit was drowning in alarms. Red lights flickered across the control panel like a casino gone wrong. Flight 2743 was in freefall. Altitude dropping fast, Karen shouted, gripping the controls. "We've lost the right engine completely." Mike's pulse hammered. He tried to steady the plane, but the aircraft was fighting back, tilting dangerously. "Denver Control, this is Flight 2743, declaring an emergency. We have engine failure and need immediate clearance for an emergency landing." His voice, usually so controlled, was edged with something rare, fear. The response crackled through the radio. "Flight 2743, roger that. Closest airport is Amarillo, Texas. Can you make it?" Karen cut in before Mike could answer. "Not at this rate. We're dropping too fast." The cabin turns to chaos. In the passenger area, screams filled the space. A mother clutched her son, whispering prayers. The businessman in 14A, the same one who had criticized Mike for kicking Daniel off, now dug his nails into the armrest, white-knuckled. A flight attendant struggled to keep her voice steady as she shouted over the chaos. "Brace position. Heads down." In first class, an older man with aviation experience muttered to himself. "They need to balance the descent. Why aren't they?" His eyes widened. "They don't know how. Because the one man who could have helped wasn't here." Mike's realization. In the cockpit, Karen's fingers flew over the controls. "Mike, we need a plan. We're not stabilizing." He gritted his teeth. He had trained for this. He had simulators, manuals, protocol. But nothing was working. Then, through the screaming alarms and the rush of wind, something clicked. Daniel Carter. A Marine. A combat pilot. The memory flashed through Mike's mind like a slap. He had read the name before the flight, and he had dismissed it. Daniel Carter wasn't just some disabled passenger. He was a tactical aviation specialist. Mike had shoved him off this flight, the one man who knew how to land a crippled plane under fire. He had let his pride override logic. And now, they were going down. A cruel irony. The plane lurched again, throwing Mike against the console. Karen gasped. "We're out of time." Mike's hands trembled. His voice cracked as he finally whispered the truth. Not to Karen, not to air control, but to himself. "I knew about the engine." Karen froze. "What?" "I knew there were problems. I saw the maintenance reports before takeoff." His voice was hoarse. "But I thought we could push through." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "You knew?" "I didn't think it was serious." Her hands curled into fists. "You arrogant son of a—" A voice from air control interrupted. "Flight 2743, you're coming in too hot. If you can't slow down." Mike shut his eyes for a second. Then he stopped thinking and started acting. Flaps full. Karen, still furious, followed orders. Throttle back. Another jolt. The Texas planes rushed up beneath them. Brace for impact. The world tilted. The plane hit the ground. The impact was brutal. The plane slammed into the open field outside Amarillo, Texas, skidding across dry earth. Metal screeched as the fuselage groaned in protest. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling luggage into the aisles. Passengers screamed. Mike barely registered the pain as his body jerked forward against his harness. The cockpit filled with smoke. "Karen," he croaked. She coughed violently, waving smoke away. I'm okay." Mike's vision blurred. The radio crackled with frantic voices. "Flight 2743, do you copy? Rescue is en route." He barely heard them. The weight of his mistake was suffocating. Inside the wreckage, the cabin was chaos. Some passengers were bleeding. Others sobbed in shock. A few were shouting, angry, panicked, desperate. The businessman from 14A pushed himself upright, hands shaking. "Jesus Christ!" A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, voice hoarse. "Stay calm. Help is coming." A woman clutched her child, rocking back and forth. "We're alive. We're alive." In first class, the older man, who had recognized the pilot's mistake mid-flight, muttered bitterly, "That Marine should have been here." Mike faces the fallout. Minutes later, emergency crews swarmed the wreckage. Passengers were helped out. Stretchers rolled in. Firefighters hosed down the smoldering right engine. Mike and Karen were the last to exit. As soon as Mike's feet hit the dirt, the first reporter was already there. Captain Sanders. What happened? His head pounded. He barely registered the cameras, the microphones shoved in his face. But then, is it true you removed a disabled veteran before takeoff? His stomach dropped. A paramedic grabbed his arm. Sir, you need to sit down. But the questions kept coming. Did you really force Daniel Carter off this flight? Sources say he was a Marine pilot. Was that a mistake? Did you ignore safety warnings before takeoff? Mike staggered back. The wreckage behind him, the injured passengers, the smoke curling into the sky, all of it was his fault. Daniel watches it unfold. Austin, Texas. Daniel Carter sat in his apartment, watching the disaster on TV. The news anchor's voice was crisp. Captain Mike Sanders is now facing intense scrutiny after reports emerged that he forcibly removed a disabled veteran before takeoff. That veteran, Daniel Carter, a former Marine combat pilot. Experts say his expertise could have helped in the emergency landing. Daniel exhaled slowly. The irony was almost laughable. He could have saved them, but he hadn't been given the chance. The screen cut to Mike Sanders, standing outside the wreckage, staring blankly as reporters fired questions. For the first time, Daniel saw not arrogance, but regret. A deep, crushing regret. And maybe that was punishment enough. The world had seen everything. The video of Mike Sanders standing in front of the wreckage, silent as reporters tore into him, had gone viral. News stations replayed it on a loop. Social media exploded with outrage. This man kicked out a Marine and nearly killed an entire plane full of people. His arrogance crashed that flight. Daniel Carter should have been in that cockpit. By the next morning, Mike's fate was sealed. The collapse of a career. The airline suspended him immediately. Investigators dug into the maintenance logs and confirmed his worst fear. The engine failure wasn't sudden. It was preventable. He had seen the warning signs before takeoff. He had ignored them. Now, every headline had his name. FAA investigates disgraced pilot Mike Sanders. Passengers demand answers. He put us all at risk. The Marine he abandoned could have saved them all. Daniel's decision. Back in Austin, Texas, Daniel Carter watched it all unfold. People called him a hero for doing nothing. It felt hollow. One afternoon, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A rough breath on the other end. Then, Daniel. Mike. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Mike spoke. I was wrong. Daniel didn't let him off easy. Yeah. You were. More silence. Then, a hoarse whisper. I should have let you stay on that flight. Daniel let the words settle. The weight of them. You know, he said, voice calm, a good leader admits when he's wrong. Mike exhaled, almost a laugh, but it was broken, hollow. Then I guess I'm a little late. Daniel thought for a long time. Then, finally. Yeah. A pause. But you're here now. Mike didn't answer. Maybe because, for the first time in his life, he didn't have one. The call ended. Final consequences. Mike Sanders lost everything. His pilot's license revoked, career in ruins, name forever tainted. Daniel Carter walked away respected. The world saw his strength, even if he never set foot on that plane. The irony remained. The man Mike deemed a liability was the only one who could have saved them. And in the end, fate delivered the cruelest lesson of all. Some crashes you survive. Others, you never walk away from.